So I'm going to talk about transitional safeguarding, and I'm not an expert, well, in anything, really. I just have the privilege of a job that involves lots of thinking and reading, which I never had time to do when I worked in local government. So I am not here to train you. You are not puppies. We're just going to have a rant. I'm going to rant at you with some references, and then you're going to bring your professional expertise to bear and think about what this means for Solihull. Hope that's okay. And I said to Rachel before, no pressure, but I've just come fresh out of Greater Manchester talking about teenagers and transitions and whatnot. And I said, oh, you want to take a look at Solihull? They've got an all-age exploitation protocol and screening tool. So apologies in advance if people start mithering you to come and check out your practice. But, you know, I think good to share good work where it's happening. Now, all being well, it's going to let me share my screen at this point. By way of introduction for folks that I've not met before, my name's Des. I run a charity. We're very proud to be a not-for-profit, and we help people who work with children and adults to use evidence in their work. We're not a what work centre, important though they are. When we talk about evidence-informed practice, we don't mean sort of randomised controlled trials turned into manuals for licensed programmes, which may indeed be very useful. We think that evidence-informed practice is about triangulating robust, legit research, good quality data that you've properly kicked the tyres on and critically appraised, alongside professional wisdom, all the stuff that you guys are experts in. And we see people's lived experience as a valid source of evidence. And I mentioned that as a precursor to saying I'm not going to be quoting RCTs at you and telling you to go and read the journals. I hope that's welcome. So in a second, it's going to let me share this. You will get the slides afterwards, so please don't worry about, you know, taking detailed notes or anything like that. That won't be required of you. Oh no, there we go. Rachel, I can only see your face. Can I get a thumbs up if that's working, please? Ta. So, transitional safeguarding. I'm not going to rehearse this too much because I reckon you absolutely know this inside and out. But there are a number of arguments for why we are needing to innovate in how we safeguard teenagers and indeed young adults. First and foremost, fairly obviously, we know that teenagers can often experience harms outside the family home. You might hear the term contextual safeguarding, which is a particular approach that aims to respond to harms outside the family home. And that has demanded, I think, a lot of innovation from the sector over the last 10 years or so. We also know, I feel embarrassed putting this second bullet point because it's so obvious, but it apparently still needs repeating at the moment. Harm doesn't stop at 18, especially harms like exploitation, criminal and sexual exploitation, peer-on-peer abuse, community-based violence. That stuff doesn't stop at 18. Trauma doesn't stop at 18. The brain doesn't even stop developing at 18. And, you know, it makes it increasingly perverse to think that some of our support does indeed stop at 18. So this is a system redesign issue. Nothing short of a revolution, I would suggest, but, you know, easy for me to say. Now, people don't fit into neat boxes, do they? And you know this very, very well in your roles. There are lots of different types of harm and adversity, and they're usually connected in multiple intersecting ways. Vulnerability is not the opposite of culpability or the opposite of resilience. These are dynamic, situational constructs. I always get really concerned when I hear language like vulnerable adult, or one, because I think it's really infantilizing. I want to be like a more politically correct, you know, Joan Rivers when I'm in my 80s. I don't want to be thought of as frail and vulnerable. But also, in terms of children, vulnerable children need our protection. Oh, and the naughty ones don't. You know, so we need to be really careful about using language in a way that is deterministic rather than seeing these constructs as situational dynamic. The transition to adulthood, and you will know this better than most, is a process, not an event. It doesn't happen overnight on our 18th birthday. It's a process. That process is called adolescence, and it goes on for quite a long time. And our experience of that process is heavily influenced by our environment, our experiences, our strengths, protective factors, and adversities. All of us going through the transition to adulthood, some of us might think we've completed that transition, some of us not so much. We all need a bit of extra care and support when we're going through big changes, even if we don't have formally defined care and support needs with a capital C and a capital S, as set out in the Care Act. So really think about how we design a system in which young people, and I am deliberately using the United Nations definition of youth there, which is 14 to 25. So when I say young people, I'm talking mid-teens to mid-20s, roundabout. We can't just rescue them and do to them. We've got to work in a way which respects them and really galvanises their resilience. And that means being developmental in our approach. And happily enough, the moral argument and the economic argument pull in the same direction. So more power to your elbow, really. So when we're talking about transitional safeguarding, we're really trying to think about boundary spanning. We want to enable boundary spanning practice. That requires boundary spanning policy and requires leaders and managers who have a boundary spanning mindset. I'll come back to that little bit of jargon in a minute. Because the current system is deeply polarised, deeply binary. You have, as one director said to me, two planets, the child protection planet and the adult safeguarding planet. Child protection planet, of course, the children safeguarding planet is led by the child protection agenda and legislation, and making safeguarding personal, the initiative, the policy agenda that underpins our work to safeguard adults. One director said to me, they're two different planets and the planets are moving even further apart. And I've got real sympathy with that, actually. I think it's why the kind of work that you're doing around exploitation is so important. You're trying to knit together a system where the component parts are not well connected. And some of our young people fall through the gap in that binary system. Some of our care experienced young people we know can go on to have really difficult adult lives, at which point our support has fallen away. We know that some of our young people with learning needs, mental health needs, can be poorly served. As another director said to me, heartbreakingly, I really felt this one. He said, I'm not so worried about my young people who've got a learning disability. It's the ones who've only got a difficulty, the ones who don't meet the bar for support from adult services. And I really understood that sense of not meeting the bar. I've got a friend, she's in her 40s, she's trying to access mental health support. And as she puts it rather crudely, I don't think I'm bad, sad or mad enough yet. I really understood that. I really understood that sense of not meeting the bar to get the help that they want. And many of our young people who are affected by extrafamilial harm outside the family, and that very often crosses over with those involved in the justice system. So that is the endeavour that you're engaged in. You are trying to bring together and create a system in which there isn't a flipping great gap, because gaps are where citizens fall through. That's the sort of simple version. So we introduced this concept of transitional safeguarding back in 2018, not because we're particularly clever, but because we were just giving a voice to what folks like you have been saying for years. You've always known this, that what we need is an approach to safeguarding adolescents and young adults, doing that fluidly across these distinct developmental life stages, building on best available evidence, learning from each of those planets, and really making sure that we're not only protecting young people, but we're also preparing them for ongoing adult life. I'm really sorry for introducing more jargon as well. I live in hope of a time when we aren't going to need language like complex safeguarding, contextual safeguarding, transitional safeguarding, person-centred safeguarding, trauma. We'll just do good safeguarding and it will be all of those things. Really important for us to remember though, of course, transitional safeguarding is not just transition planning for people who are moving between services with disabilities, for example. Transitional behaviours are a human condition. We must stop using service language. Sometimes you could be forgiven for thinking that only people with disabilities undergo transition. No, we all did or are still going through that transition. And importantly, some of what comes through in what local areas are doing under the transitional safeguarding agenda actually falls outside of the traditional notion of safeguarding. So it's safeguarding with a small s, not a big S. Sometimes, and I'll give you a link at the end, some local areas shared with us examples of what they were doing, which was really creative. It wasn't statutory safeguarding. It was creatively commissioned local charitable providers who could do everything from, help Rachel get her locks changed and give her a lift the first 3 counselling sessions. Preventative safeguarding support. And I think that's really important to recognise, because part of what we're getting at here is that safeguarding is a verb, not a noun. It's a thing we do, an act we undertake when the citizens of Solihull need us to, because their safety is undermined. It's not a noun, a destination to be reached, a place to be sent. And we have, I think, sometimes in safeguarding adults language, we might sometimes be using noun language. Oh, well, that's not safeguarding because they haven't got care and support needs. And my reflection, understandable though that is, my reflection is we've been here in children's 10 years or so. People were looking at sexual exploitation of kids and saying that's not child protection because it's not happening in the family. We were using noun mindsets for what needs to be a verb mindset. And that's a bit wafty. I hope that makes sense to people. And of course, there are really good reasons why we think about eligibility criteria for adult safeguarding. It's very, very important that we don't over-intrude into people's lives because, human rights still matter, or at least I think they did. Who knows what the government's done since I started talking 5 minutes ago. I'm a fan of human rights anyway. So there are good reasons not to over-intrude and to have that sense of eligibility criteria. We might wonder, colleagues, whether we've become preoccupied with eligibility at the expense of prevention. Is that good for citizens? Is it good for the public purse? I would suggest not. Let's think about that together. Oh, and I will just say as well, transitional safeguarding is not a prescribed model. It's a set of principles that local areas are using according to their context, being adapted to local context. It's not like we don't get to the end and me sell you a license. All right, I'm going to share the thinking and it's for you to consider whether this resonates with Solihull. And this is not an issue of practitioners need to be trained so much as an issue of systems leadership. So systems leadership is the approach we need when we're confronting what are sometimes called wicked issues or VUCA issues. All colleagues, I'll just invite you to mute yourselves if you're not me, because it will really help with sound control. Thanks, with sound quality. Ta. And also, because in my other talk I did today, someone had left their mic on and I heard them say, yeah, it's actually all right. And I'm listening to a woman called Dez. She's quite interesting, you know, which I thought was damning with faint praise. Anyway, so VUCA issues of volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. Everything you do, frankly, I would suggest in terms of safeguarding is a VUCA issue. And when we're addressing those kinds of issues, we need not that traditional command and control conveyor belt factory leadership. We need systems leadership. A few things that tell you you're doing systems leadership. One, it's collective. It's a team sport, not a solo sport. You do it together as the Solihull system. You're a squad. Secondly, it's participative, not performative. It's a thing you do, not warm words you offer. It's the opposite of what we've seen at COP26, for example, where there's quite a lot of performative leadership, I would suggest. And thirdly, systems leadership, by definition, is boundary spanning. There's that word again. Boundary spanning, you know, where we deliberately and consciously reach across borders, be they geographical, age-related, professional service boundaries, conceptual boundaries. We reach into the spaces between the silos to build relationships, interconnections, interdependencies, because that is the only way in which we can manage complex social problems. So I suppose I'm inviting you not to stay in your lane, but to squirm your way into the spaces between the silos where all the magic can happen and, you know, and some of the mess, frankly, really happens. But let me bring some more important voices into the conversation, some young adults who've really helped me think about transitional safeguarding as we were developing the literature. Max is a young man who was chairing a conference with me years ago now. He just turned 19, and he was saying to this room full of social workers how they'd done a really good job. He was removed into care as a young child. He did a really good job. Thanks ever so much. You kept me really safe. You wrapped me up tight in bubble wrap, but I'm 19 now and I kind of feel like I can't move my arms. And it really stayed with me, because what Max is really pushing us to recognise there is that the system did a great job of protecting him. It didn't do a very good job of preparing him. I've stayed in contact with Max over the years. He's just written a chapter in a book for me, actually. He's a fabulous young man. And he talked about how in keeping in contact or trying to access mental health support as an adult, he said, of course, a different language, isn't it? All different language, because he's quite good at jargon. He's been doing Children Care Council stuff for donkey's years. He thought he knew jargon. He didn't know adults' jargon. And he said to me with a wry smile, yeah, you didn't tell me I had the right to make unwise decisions. You kept that quiet when I was a teenager, didn't you? Yeah, we do like to keep that quiet. God forbid we should tell children at 16 they have capacity assumed in the eyes of the law, eh? Kelly's a young woman who at the time of giving this quote in her 20s was being supported by a sexual exploitation service, and in Kelly's local authority, the sexual exploitation service is hosted by adult social care, managed by adult safeguarding, and they work with victim survivors aged 13, 14 and up. So transitional by design. Cool. Kelly said, I couldn't wait to get to 18. I thought once I was an adult, everything would change, but it hasn't worked out that way. I wish I was a kid again so you could lock me up. Now, no criticism for the people who've been supporting Kelly. I'm sure those professionals have absolutely worked their socks off. But with respect, when a young adult, when a citizen equates safety with incarceration, we haven't got the person-centred safeguarding right. And Aisha, also care experienced, very, very articulate, and talked about how now having left care, she's particularly lonely. She had some very interesting reflections, incidentally, on how one of the reasons why she's so lonely upon leaving care is because she spent the last few years spending all her time in consultation exercises, co-production workshops and conferences. She didn't have any mates her own age. What an unintended consequence of ill thought through participation. I digress, different workshop. So Aisha's telling me how loneliness is a safeguarding issue, but no one understands it's a safeguarding issue. And she's right, of course. If Aisha was in her 70s, we'd be all over that. I think we're pretty good at recognising isolation and loneliness as a safeguarding issue for older adults, but we seem to have a blind spot for our younger adults. So I asked Aisha to explain to me why her loneliness is a safeguarding issue, and she gave a very, very comprehensive and lucid account of her pathway to harm. And I won't quote her directly because it was a bit not safe for work, but in essence, because I get really lonely and that makes me shack up with blokes who aren't very good for me, or words to that effect. And then she said something so profound. She said, but unless you're worried about my child, I won't hear from you lot again, will I? And she's got us bang to rights, hasn't she? Because unless her care and support needs escalate to the point, unless her adversities and harms and risks escalate to the point that she has formally defined care and support needs, like some of those blokes who aren't very nice to her, trigger mental health, crisis, or substance misuse to the point where she's unable to protect herself, she won't qualify for safeguarding support in her own right. The way in which we will talk about safeguarding is through the failure to protect lens. That suggests to me that we aren't really designing a system where young people are empowered and enabled to be an active part of their own safeguarding journey. So quite a profound challenge there from some of our young citizens, and I bet that the young people of Solihull would give equally important, profound challenges to us. So when we're talking about transitional safeguarding, I really try to emphasise to people that there are these kind of 6 key principles. They're non-negotiable, they all interact like Olympic rings, and you can't cherry pick them. Everything else is up for grabs. You tell me what matters most in Solihull. As you design and seek to continuously refine your system, and it is a system, not a service, be evidence informed. Draw on legit, robust, relevant research and data. See professionals' wisdom as a source of evidence, and absolutely draw on that lived experience of your communities as part of your evidence base. Sounds obvious, worth saying though. In the middle there, this system, and I am not going to give you an age definition, by the way. I'm not going to tell you it's 16 to 24, like that's your business. Some areas are saying 13 to 30. Sounds a bit bold to me, but good luck to them. Other areas are really thinking about that 16 to 25. That's your business. But wherever you put the boundaries to your system, you really want it to be contextual, or you could say ecological in its mindset. Contextual safeguarding is a very specific term coined by Professor Carleen Furman, link at the bottom there. I'm not on commission, but I do chair her board, full disclosure. When you're thinking about contextual safeguarding, of course, and many people know this, it's a set of particular tools and approaches that allow us to lift our lens from the individual young person and to think about the spaces, places and contexts in which they experience safety or indeed harm. Links to Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. If there are any Bronfenbrenner fans out there, I'm one. Where we think about a person's development as involving their microsystem, their immediate family, but also think about their mesosystem, the communities, their peer groups, society, the Solihull neighbourhoods, right up through to thinking about kind of meta systems around social oppression, or indeed, God help us, Brexit. Sorry, I really must throw myself in on that stuff. So thinking about the context and the ecology of a person. In the middle there, transitional, developmental. You want the system, fairly obviously, to really reflect what we know about the developmental life stage of adolescence and emerging adulthood. Because we're pretty good at it in things like gerontological social work. We've designed it around what we know about older adults' developmental needs. We're pretty good in the early years, where we've designed our early years offer, funding notwithstanding, around things like infant attachment, child development. Adolescence and emerging adulthood are their own distinct, developmentally specific and incredibly interesting and important life stage. We need to adopt a developmental perspective, and we need to give some space for our skilled professionals to exercise judgment and fluidity within that. Because if you're working with me and I'm 15 and a half, but you really properly know me, you know that I understand myself, my place in the world, and you know that I need you to give me a lot more voice and choice and control than the law might dictate you should. Conversely, if you're working with me and I'm 18, 19, 20, 21, but you properly know me, you might recognise that I need you to ratchet up your protective capacity, even though I am legally an adult. It's about knowing the bones of the people we serve. And if that sounds scary, Health have been doing it for years. Sort of the basis of Gillett competency and Fraser guidelines is that we allow our professionals to exercise nuanced judgment about the young person in front of them. Thirdly there, crucially, relational. The system must always foreground, prioritise, promote and enable relational practice, person-centred practice, capacity building practice and trauma-attuned practice. More on that in a minute. Number 5, radical system redesign, and we should aim for nothing less. This is a chance for us to pay much better attention to equalities, equity, diversity and inclusion, because we have frankly not done a good enough job. Let's call a spade, folks. It is not acceptable that we have young people, and remember I'm including young adults here, who are neurodivergent or have learning needs overrepresented as both victims and instigators of exploitation. It's not acceptable that young men and boys consistently have their sexual harm overlooked, and that some of our assessment tools screen out boys and men. It's not acceptable that young women ensnared in community-based violence and criminal endeavours are not well responded to by the justice system. And it's not acceptable that black children and black young people are overrepresented in our justice population, and I would say not coincidentally, in our school exclusion data. The same is also true of Gypsy Roma Traveller children, young people. We know we just need to get so much better at this, and I think transitional safeguarding really invites us, because all that stuff, all that structural adversity, structural trauma, structural oppression also doesn't stop at 18. So a real life course approach here. And then all the way through it, like a sticky rocker course, we've got to be participative. The way we design this offer, the way we gather our evidence, the way we measure the impact, and the actual practice we do, always got to be with you, not to you or for you. Nothing about you without you and all that. And that's particularly important in the context of exploitation, because we need to be offering young people self-efficacy and a bit of control. Very, very briefly, because I mentioned the word trauma. Trauma-attuned practice does not begin nor end with doing an ACEs checklist. ACEs is Adverse Childhood Experiences, if you're not familiar, very, very popular at the moment, based on some very interesting research in the 90s by Folletti. And in essence, it looks at a range of adversities that happened within the child's home or home environment: domestic abuse, parental mental health issues, maltreatment. And it identifies a clear link then to later negative health outcomes, increased diabetes or drug misuse, so on and so forth. But there are some considerations, and you might want to think a bit critically about this, because none of those structural factors are included. You know, poverty, homelessness, racism, hunger. Bereavement's not included. The checklist approach doesn't allow me to differentiate. My parents' divorce might have been the best thing that ever happened to me just because it's on the ACEs checklist. How do we, differentiate? And there's a really important report that came out in 2020 from the Early Intervention Foundation, where they highlighted that although ACEs are very, very popular, the evidence base underpinning them is not quite as solid as we might imagine. And of course, there are some ethical issues about things like routine screening. I know some local areas have thought about doing routine ACEs screening at the front door. And I get the intention, but two things. One, Folletti's research was never, ever, ever intended to be used as an individually predictive tool. And two, if you imagine someone you love dearly and they have to tell their most private, personal, painful story to a stranger, how much training would you want that stranger to have had? Because that's the brass tacks of it. Because if we expect our loved ones to be treated with more humanity than we are treating the citizens we serve, then we've got a problem. I know you know that, but it deserves saying. And the other thing to hold in mind around trauma-attuned approaches, of course, is that you don't get anything happening in practice, I would argue, if it's not mirrored up and down and across the system. So there is no trauma-informed practice without trauma-informed supervision, without trauma-informed leadership, without trauma-informed strategy. Same goes for relationship-based practice, person-centered practice, evidence-based practice. We're always taking that whole organisation lens. And linked to that, and I won't dwell on this, but I know it's one of the things that colleagues working across the wider adults partnership often raise with me as a core. You lot in children's are obsessed with neuroscience, as someone said to me. There is a bit of that. We are quite seduced by things like neuroscience sometimes. A very interesting paper called The Luster of Neuroscience that highlights this. We sometimes, you might hear this, we use neuroscience or ACEs stuff in a way which is really simplistic. You see things like that brain scan at the bottom being used all the time in things like foster care training. Look what neglect does to the child's brain. Whoa, no, it doesn't. There's a little tweet from Bruce Perry, who is a very, very esteemed academic. And as it happens, the fellow whose study generated that brain scan image, he's literally on Twitter publicly begging us to stop using that image. That's quite unusual for an academic to break ranks and literally beg us to stop misusing imagery. And we need to ask ourselves, why do we find things like that misinterpreted brain science, things like ACEs checklist or RAG rating or simplicity? Why do we find them so seductive? And I think it might be because the work is so complex and scary that we're sometimes desperately seeking to create order in what feels like chaos. And what we're actually doing there, if we're not careful, is we're making ourselves feel safer, or our managers feel safer, or the inspectors feel safer. In fact, everyone feels safer apart from the kid. And we need to hold on to that and think quite critically about what that means for safeguarding young adults in a rights-based, person-centred way. Anyway, enough ranting about that. Let's bust a couple of myths. You will know this because you're skilled professionals, but there has been a bit of a myth over the years that adult safeguarding means, well, if they don't want our help, we just walk away. Whoa, that's not quite true at all, is it? We know that, having capacity doesn't mean you consent to abuse, to state the obvious. And actually, making safeguarding personal and transitional safeguarding really push on that curious, tenacious, relationship-based practice. If Rachel says, I don't want your support, I don't feel unsafe, leave me alone, my first question is, oh, I wonder why Rachel doesn't see what's happening to her as harmful. Does Rachel not believe she deserves protection? Does Rachel not trust me? Does Rachel not trust professionals? Did I catch Rachel on the wrong day or the wrong time? Does someone else need to deliver this message? We ask and ask and ask and ask and ask. We don't go, phew, fantastic, because, we're a bit overstretched right now. Which brings me to the point about, the Care Act doesn't tell us who we can't support. It tells us who we must support. We must support those who have formally identified care and support needs, where they reach eligibility criteria for things like Section 42 inquiries. It doesn't tell us who, as local areas, as a whole partnership, we are able to support. It's a floor target, not a stretch target, I suppose is what I'm saying. And interestingly, colleagues, the eligibility stuff in the Care Act, which is really important, and we don't want to over-intrude in people's lives, but the prevention bit of the Care Act is written in the same size font, and it gets a lot less attention. So the Care Act also tells us that we have a duty to prevent, reduce and delay care and support needs emerging. So that 17-year-old who's been ensnared in exploitation for 3 or 4 years, you can use that prevention principle as a lever for continuing ongoing support. Because if there is a chance to stop that young person under 18 from going on to develop entrenched mental health difficulties or health impairments, then we have a lever to do so. And I do think that, and I will say this, I'm not going to defend the indefensible funding position that you find yourself in, but I do think that over a decade of sustained austerity has rather clouded our judgment. So of course we are wholly preoccupied with gatekeeping and eligibility because the resources are so constrained, but it means we're not spending what little resource we have most effectively because eligibility has completely eclipsed prevention. Discuss. And of course, we need to understand that, there is an argument that says, oh, that's all very well and good in the research, Des, but in the eyes of the law, they are an adult. Well, not all bits of legislation, of course. Some bits of primary legislation and statutory guidance absolutely honour the need for ongoing support for some groups, some populations. Sentencing provisions under the parole board are different for 18 to 21-year-olds. We have all sorts of nuances within our legislation, and in fact, the law just reflects a common understanding at a given point in time. It's changing all the time. Child sexual exploitation being a good example there. Turns out it's not promiscuity, and it was safeguarding, the verb, not the noun. It was as late as 1991 that marital rape was challenged in a court of law as a criminal act. 1991. The law changes all the time because we as a society are changing and developing our understanding all the time. And of course, the argument that we can't afford to do anything differently, yeah, I get that. We don't hear that argument very often because now we can't afford not to, let's be honest, and we can't afford to keep doing what we're doing for many reasons, one of which, and you know this, don't you, it's all connected. All the harms and adversities and issues that play into your work are all connected. People don't sit in nice, neat boxes because these issues are all connected. Poverty makes you poorly. That's not a political statement, that's a statement of fact backed up by big data, 4 Nations research, unequivocally, thanks to people like Paul Bywaters. Poverty makes you poorly. Being poorly makes you more likely to be poor. Being poor and poorly is more likely if you're a member of a minoritised population. Minoritised, not minority, incidentally, taking a global perspective. We know that being poor and poorly makes parenting damn near impossible, and parenting's already the second hardest job in the world, step parenting being the first. We know that exploitation can be a driver for homelessness, and homelessness can drive exploitation. We know that trauma can mean that some people, for example, might seek to self-medicate. That can leave them more exposed to things like drug debt bondage, which in turn can drive exploitation, which in turn can then drive homelessness. It's all connected. Our prisons are full of people who had difficult childhoods, who experienced abuse, trauma and neglect. We need an interconnected system of support, and the closest we've got to a magic wand is commissioning. Because however constrained statutory services might feel, the way we commission can be more holistic, more place-based, more interconnected. And we have to do this locally. The stuff you're doing locally is a game changer. It's not going to come from the centre. The centre is a little fragmented at the moment anyway, and it's the nature of government departments. They can't always work in an integrated way, to be fair to them. Just one example of the nuance here, Mental Capacity Act, as you will all know, presumes capacity from the age of 16. Great, I could back that. Let's give them the vote, for example. Interested to contrast that with the child criminal exploitation definition, almost identical to the child sex exploitation definition, because that says, even if it looks consensual, if they're under 18, it constitutes abuse. Well, equally a defensible position, but quite hard to justify individual practitioners having to navigate that. The Domestic Abuse Act also takes an age 16 definition. So you could have a 17-year-old in Solihull ensnared in an exploitative relationship, personal relationship, interrelationship. You could define them as a victim survivor of CSE. You could define them as a victim survivor of domestic abuse. You could define them as a person with capacity exercising their right to make an unwise decision in relation to their personal relationships. All three of them would be defensible, but the response they would receive is very, very different according to the terminology and definitions we use. And I don't think it's acceptable to leave individual professionals to have to navigate that. Local leaders and local innovation is so, so crucial to joining these dots. And when we talk about boundary spanning, we're not just boundary spanning between children's and adult safeguarding, we're boundary spanning between people safeguarding and community safety and justice, as this graph about knife crime, or knife-related homicides, in fact, shows us. So 10-year period looking at knife-related homicides, stripping out domestic abuse, I believe, so this is like community-based violence from the ONS. That red line there, those 71 souls who lost their lives to knives, young men aged 18 to 24. 16 to 24-year-olds are consistently shown in the data as being particularly vulnerable to knife crime and so-called serious youth violence. Now, we say safeguarding is everybody's business, don't we? They're no one's business. They're not children's safeguarding business because they aged out. They're not adult safeguarding business if they don't have formally defined care and support needs. But my God, they're someone's son, someone's brother, someone's nephew, someone's dad in some cases. They're our citizens, aren't they? They're our citizens, and they're dying partly because we haven't given folks like you the space to radically reform the system as you so much want to. Now, I say they don't have care and support needs, but when you look at the data that the Justice Select Committee explored when they were looking at 18 to 24-year-olds in prison, turns out they do have care and support needs at very high rates. So 18 to 24-year-olds in the general population, about 2 to 4% of us have a learning disability. Could be as high as a third, same age group in custody. And you see that disproportionality in relation to communications impairment, ADHD, autism, head injury involving loss of consciousness. And what's particularly heartbreaking, folks, is that the Justice Select Committee heard reams of evidence suggesting that most of these young people, largely young men, disproportionately young men of colour, didn't even have those care and support needs identified until we'd already locked them up. But I reckon, folks, we knew them, didn't we? We knew an awful lot of these young people over the years. We knew some of them very early doors, I'd wager. And we know that those young adults involved in the criminal justice system are themselves often victims. They carry a high degree of trauma, abuse, bereavement, neglect, maltreatment. They're the same kids we were worried about. On Tuesday afternoon, they were a vulnerable young person at risk. By Thursday morning, they're an adult in the criminal justice system who represents a risk. Nothing else changed in their lives apart from their birthday. Now, I'm not arguing against prison, well, at least not in this talk. It's a necessary part of our penal system, I'm sure. But we do need to think critically about the boundary we have put in place, which completely reconceptualises a citizen, their entitlements, their rights, their freedoms, their protections, and their safeguarding needs. So how do we create a system in which resilience is at the heart of it? Well, I would say through participation, because when we work with people in a way which honours and promotes their self-efficacy, that self-efficacy is like feeling you're a bit in charge of life, that is how we target some of their resilience, because resilience isn't like a substitute for support. It's sure as hell not code for cuts. But resilience is about using what you've got in you and what you've got around you. And when we're scared, and we get very, very scared about people's experience of exploitation, we get scared in our work to safeguard, I think particularly in our work to safeguard teenagers at the moment, it's scary stuff. We can tip into kind of high control practice, doing whatever we can to keep a young person safe. Even that language, keep them safe. Help them to be and feel safe. And we can lose the fact that we've got to work in a way which is really participative. I think adult safeguarding colleagues are very, very skilled at this, balancing risk and rights and person-centred approaches, because our right to protect and participation are mutually dependent. So finding a way to enable practitioners across the multi-agency workforce to know that it's both and, not either or, both protection and participation. And again, really making sure that our colleagues who work with adults who are very, very skilled in this have those talents drawn upon, are able to exercise them. There's a lot we could learn from harm reduction principles and substance misuse, isn't there? Because the sweet spot we're aiming for here is where young people remember I'm including young adults, are active partners in their own safeguarding, but they're not held responsible for their own harm. And in terms of what we could do, well, you're well on your way, aren't you? We could learn from all the other parts of the system that are more transitional, like special educational needs and disabilities, young carers assessment duties, mental health long-term commissioning plan up to 25. In fact, it's almost only safeguarding that's retained this rather quaint binary mindset. So let's learn from all the other interesting stuff that you've been doing in Solihull, indeed across your region and the country. Let's draw down the very best of our skilled work to safeguard adults, that rights-based, person-centred approach to safeguarding. Why haven't we got making safeguarding personal for young people? We should, in my view, and in the view of cleverer people than me that wrote the article with me. And especially if they're 16 anyway, and they have capacity presumed. It's very telling, I think, to know that, that very, very famous judgment that we use all the time when talking about adult safeguarding, Justice Mumby, I think it was, what good is it making someone safe if we only make them miserable? If we're really, really blunt with ourselves, I think we're very relaxed about making under 18s extremely miserable as long as they're physically safe. Isn't it interesting to notice that disjunct? So what could we draw down from our best work with adults? And what could we draw up from our best work with teenagers? Why do we not have contextual safeguarding for adults, for example? It would lend itself beautifully to that place-based approach. And of course, adult safeguarding has always been preoccupied with harm outside the home. Institutional abuse, of course, was the underpinning for No Secrets back in 2000. God, I'm dating myself now. So they lend themselves really well to innovation. We might want to think about iatrogenic interventions, nicking a word from health there, whether medicine makes you more poorly. We don't have a word like iatrogenic in safeguarding, and I think we might need one, because some of what we're doing might not be helping, despite our best efforts. For colleagues who are interested in commissioning and doing complexity-attuned commissioning, highly commend a body of work called Human Learning Systems, really creating alliances, not procurement exercises. And when we're thinking about building our local kind of business case for change, good stats and stories, the human stories as well as the statistics. And it does sound a bit expensive in some ways, doesn't it, doing innovation? But we should be really honest, because what we're doing now is remarkably poor value for money. When we invest in preventative and recovery-oriented work, that can help us avoid later costs. When we don't help people recover from trauma, we know those problems can worsen, and that can mean not only more intrusive intervention, but also more expensive interventions. The economic and the moral argument pull in the same direction, because the system and the spend is all connected. And if we gave local areas much more visibility across whole place expenditure, the business case would write itself, frankly, because when we walk away from people at 18, they don't stop costing us money. They tip up on our mental health population, our substance misuse population, our criminal justice population, because there's a service with no waiting list. They have their own kids. So we're feeding a very expensive and somewhat inhumane machine, and you've always known this as skilled professionals. So someone asked me this morning who's doing good work, and I said, check out Solihull. Here are some other folks who I think are doing good work. Hampshire and Portsmouth got quite interesting multi-agency risk management framework. The Preparation for Adulthood initiative, I love Birmingham's one, incidentally. Southend, rather than all age exploitation, mirror children's and adults exploitation protocols and models. Hackney have got some really good strategic tripartite leadership, children safeguarding, community safety and safeguarding adults, owning the transitional safeguarding agenda. The North East are one to watch, I think. Sheffield, Suffolk, Camden, Dorset and BCP, I'm quite in Baines. You'd be in good company pushing on this. And let's think about what opportunities you've got. ICS, Integrated Care Systems, it's sucking all the oxygen out of local areas right now. I wonder if that's a little lever for more transitional life course thinking. The renationalisation of probation, there's an opportunity not to be missed. Children's Social Care Review, for example, the Joint Transitions Protocol for Youth Justice and National Probation, all sorts of things we can pull on, because what you don't want is for transitional safeguarding to be another project. You want transitional safeguarding to be some of the connective tissue between the variety of agendas you guys are already working on and making great progress within. And some of the local areas that I've had the privilege of working with, and the ones that really impress me are, they've got that really clear, credible local leadership from the top with feeling. They're really, really pushing this from the top. They're expansive in how they define partnership, and they very much include their communities as partners in the work. The places where they know that what they're trying to build here is a system, not a service. The places where they really, really get that when you're doing innovation, it's the soft stuff, it's the hard stuff, it's the egos, emotions, values, ethos, behaviours. It's not the lanyards and the thresholds that will make a thing work or not. and where I see that real respect for practitioner wisdom, using practitioner wisdom to inform their strategy. Because, you know, how else do we do this as system leaders? How else do we really shift ourselves into a position where safeguarding is a verb, not a noun? And people like you have known for years, and as do your citizens that you serve, binary notions of childhood versus adulthood, victim versus perpetrator, resilience versus versus vulnerability. It's a nonsense. It's not helping people. It's making your job even harder. I've never ever met a professional working in this field who doesn't absolutely understand this and could articulate it 1,000 times better than me. This is a systems leadership issue. We don't want all adults to be protected by statutory means or to treat them in a paternalistic way, but we do want a developmentally attuned, evidence-informed, rights-based response. This is about leaning into the complexity, striving for coherence, and I think really recognising the courage it takes from people like you to innovate locally. But I am glad you're doing it, because innovation is always best led locally by people who know their patch and care about their people. I think we should absolutely take advantage of the fact that national government have got, you know, other priorities going on right now. We can get some real work done, can't we? Because, you know, if not now, when? And no pressure, Solihull, but if not you, who? That's enough ranting. I've no idea about time, so I'm really sorry if I've ruined everything, Rachel. I'll stop harping on at that point.
Thanks, Des. No, you're ahead of time, so that's absolutely fantastic.
In which case, I'm sorry for speaking to you quickly.
No, it was perfect. Thank you. I think there was a lot of information there to digest, wasn't there? So has anyone got any questions for Des at this point in terms of what she's... Oh,
I just wanted to make clear, I'm also taking heckles, Rachel, because you won't always agree with the research. It won't always resonate with your professional experience. So yeah, if you disagree with anything, even better, because that's a real test that you were listening. You will definitely get the slides and the recording. And there's links at the end of my slide with stuff you can read that gives you some of those local examples I shared. I'm not having this, Rachel. I definitely know they're not that quiet as a group. So let me ask a question.
Given what they said at the start, there should be lots there.
Given the oversharing that we opened with. But I wonder, I mean, does it make sense? Do you see your professional challenges reflected in that literature base? Charlie?
I just want to say thank you, really. I really enjoyed that. I also don't like silence, so that was I thought I'd fill it. I'm a community partner, actually. I'm not the council. I'm not sure if, you know, I was invited, don't worry, I've not snuck on. But it's that's what we do. I run a youth charity for teenagers, and one of our biggest challenges is when they hit 18. And wanting to continue working with them, and what do we do and how do we do it, and can they be in the same building now because they're 18 and now they're a risk to the other ones, and all that sort of thing. So it was really fantastic. I'm looking forward to getting the slides and reading more into it.
Thank you, I appreciate that. You make me think of back in the olden days when we were allowed to do this stuff face to face. I was doing a day workshop about transitional safeguarding with 3 local authority areas and their partners. All the multi-agency partners, and at the end of the day a director said, God, well, we've got a fantastic charity that works with our under 18s who experience exploitation, we just need them to do it for adults. At which point the chief executive's charity stood up and went, we do, we just don't tell you because you don't pay us for it. And I reckon that's happening up and down the country every day, that people like yourselves in all different roles are subverting the system to get the real work done. And actually just by having honest conversations about what you're doing, we might unlock some stuff. So thank you for raising that. Arvinda, did I see a hand go up? And please correct me, colleagues, if I say your names wrong at any point, won't you?
Yeah, Arvi did have her hand up. Arvi, did you go down again? I think can't see you.
Oh, can you see me now?
No, but we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I'm not really sure why that is. Okay.
There you are. I can see you now.
Hi, Des. Yeah, it was just more of a comment, really. Thank you very much for yet another sort of thought-provoking session, because I actually did attend an event not long ago, and each time I'm listening to the way in which you're delivering the information, it's getting me to reflect So I work in the clinical commissioning group, and just looking at it from a whole system perspective, not just about like sort of health and social care and how we're joining up with our other partner agencies. It's very helpful. Just continue to remind myself in how do we continue to have those conversation, and some of those are challenging conversations, to look at how we're going to be moving forward in terms of the transitional aspect of our children, young people, as they're entering into adulthood. So just wanted to say thank you very much for that.
Oh no, thank you. I appreciate that feedback. And you prompt me to note that everybody's got something really important to bring to this agenda, whatever agency or role or bit of the system they're in. And I think colleagues in health are uniquely well placed to grasp issues of social determinants, inequalities. And I think particularly through commissioning, there's an opportunity to do something quite exciting here. The human learning stuff I mentioned is human learning systems is really interesting. There's something about how we, not only in CCGs but also across other commissioning bodies, police and crime commissioners, local authorities. Commissioning is not the act of buying provision tile by tile, slice by slice. Commissioning is, to quote someone cleverer than me, it's buying capacity for local learning and adaptation. And I know that sounds a bit grand and lofty, but have you seen the work in Plymouth? The Plymouth, it's on the adult side, Plymouth something or other, Alliance maybe? Check these numbers because I'm going to misquote, but basically 20 odd organisations around the table, 20 odd million quid of public money, one contract, no KPIs, because we're an alliance, not a group of contracted services. And I know that sounds a bit radical, but the work you do is radical. It's about people. But yeah, well worth having a look at that stuff. Anything you hated, folks? Come on, I'm charging for this event unusually, so get your money's worth. Give me some tough questions. Anything you really didn't like?
Des. Des, I was just thinking as you were talking, obviously you were talking about obviously the legislations and things change at different ages, but a lot of organisations, their transition age, or the age at which they support people, stops at different ages, doesn't it, as well? And that has a really big impact on what we can provide and who we can keep round the table and to support people at the same time too.
Yes, sometimes I can find when I'm working with local areas that there's a bit of mythology. There are some things that are just really, really difficult and really counterproductive is the word I meant to use there. But actually there's also a lot of myths. There are a whole range of challenges that exist in professionals' minds, but when you actually dig into the statutory guidance or the primary legislation, no such thing exists. You hear a lot of that in the adolescent safeguarding world. We can't do child protection because it doesn't work for teenagers. Well, which bit of it? You know, section 31's a problem. Nothing wrong with section 47 or section 17. What they mean is the parents find it blaming. So talk to the parents differently. They don't like coming to meetings in the offices, so hold the meeting somewhere else. You know, there's a bit of mythology about what the barriers are. There are some genuine and legitimate barriers here. The eligibility criteria is not one of them. The Care Act is certainly not one of them. The Care Act is a fantastically useful bit of legislation in so many ways. That emphasis on well-being applies to everybody, not just those with formally defined care and support. It's that prevention principle, same size font as eligibility. So I kind of encourage people to think about, of these things that are difficult, how many of our own making? How many of them because we have locally constructed a threshold document or a commissioning framework or a practice model that does the things that we now say are getting in the way? Does that make sense? And that's not me getting government off the hook or lawmakers off the hook. It's just that sometimes we're directing our ire in the wrong place.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there anything that young people have particularly said to you when you're talking to them about some of this?
Yes, but I want to go after David, please. Hi, David.
Hi, Des. My question to you was really around capacity and the fact that when children have been through the care system, they get to 18, they start to come to the attention of, say, adult safeguarding, there is that big sort of resistance to wanting, more statutory support. And we often find that we are then, they decline our services. So I wondered if you had a kind of a view on how we maintain that, we develop that contact. I think you touched on it a little bit, but I'd just be really interested in your view.
Yeah, it's a great question, David. So I'm going to say loads of stuff that you already know, because them's the breaks, right?
Yeah.
Capacity to decline statutory service intervention is not the same as consenting to abuse. I know we all know that, but not everyone across the whole system knows that. So we should probably hire a plane to skywrite it every couple of weeks, shouldn't we? And also, a person declining statutory safeguarding with a capital S intervention doesn't mean that Solihull can't have a really rich and diverse voluntary sector and community-based offer to those citizens. We wrote something for the Chief Social Worker for Adults, which I'll stick in the chat in a minute. It's called Bridging the Gap, and it sort of describes what transitional safeguarding is, particular focus on exploitation, and why adult social work and adult safeguarding are essential to it. And in the local examples we got, none of them involved we forced an adult with capacity who declined to engage with our service to work with us. They all involved really creative, thoughtful approaches, particularly drawing on commissioned services to make an offer rather than a service. And that's important, partly because we meet citizens where they are. Safeguarding's a verb, not a noun. But it's also because, you know, let's be fair to statutory safeguarding colleagues here, it can't all be on you. It just can't be. It's really inappropriate for, if I pick on a group here, sometimes children's social workers say, well, it'd be all right if adults pick them up. No, that's not the solution. You know, sometimes I hear, you know, wider partners misunderstanding why we have thresholds and eligibility and so on and so forth. It's about protecting citizens' rights. It's not actually about gatekeeping. It's become about gatekeeping because of the indefensible funding situation. So I think really leaning into the fact that we're trying to make a whole place, whole person offer. We're trying to build a system, not a service. And that means, for example, City of London have a problem-solving panel where skilled adult safeguarding colleagues will do a little problem-solving session for any other professional who's working with someone over 18 who wants a bit of expertise. So you see that statutory expertise acting as kind of system containers and troubleshooters rather than doing all the doing. Does that make sense? I hope that kind of offers a little bit. It kind of resonates with the idea that instead of you hear in children a lot about team around the child, which
yeah,
it's better than not having a team around the child, but really the prize is team around the relationship. And I think that works much better actually in adults, because if the person I trust most in the world is my football coach or my ex-dinner lady or whoever it might be, the job of the system is to wrap support around that relationship. So maybe my voluntary sector worker, who I trust most in the world, maybe they need, you know, adult mental health on speed dial. Maybe they need some clinical supervision from adult social workers. Maybe they need different access to L&D than they'd normally get through the partnership. What they don't need is for that relationship to be severed whilst I get pinballed up into the machinery when I'm just about mad, sad or bad enough to warrant help. It's bad for professionals, it's bad for the public purse, it's bad for citizens. I'll stop ranting now, David, but I hope that resonates with your professional wisdom on this.
Absolutely, it does. And I thought that was a really interesting initiative that you're talking about there in London. And, you know, I think that connectivity with our provider services is possibly the thing that we need to work on in Solihull, especially in this kind of problem-solving area. Is something we're thinking about is positive risk-taking in adults.
Because that's the other thing you touched on. We know, you as a partnership, as a system, you know so much. Children's services colleagues could really do with better legal literacy, I respectfully suggest, and I can't think of anyone better to support them than colleagues who work with adults and understand mental capacity and are more legally literate. Colleagues and adults could probably do with learning a bit more about the impact of trauma. So what, you know, colleagues who work in youth services are brilliant at participation and so really using each other's talents in a way which I think sometimes doesn't get enough attention. And I also think as well that there's something about creating a system in which experimentation is allowed, not experimenting on citizens, but experimenting with failure amongst ourselves, making mistakes together, learning together, and that requires, I think, quite a big cultural shift sometimes.
Brilliant, thanks, Des. Thanks.
Oh, and you asked me what young people had said. I'll take the swear words out. Aisha once said to me when I was very first thinking about this, and I was like, so about transitional stuff, did you get much? Went, oh God, yeah, I got transition support when I was leaving care. They gave me cookery lessons. It was an absolute piss take. Oh God, I said I wouldn't swear. It was an absolute mockery. My mum's Jamaican. The one thing I didn't need was cookery lessons. I just thought it was such a great example of, well, you tick the box that says we're giving her independent support. That's not what she needed. What she needed was someone to help her spot a bad man before she gets together with him, you know? And she knew that, and she told us that, and we still gave her cookery lessons. I also think that these two young people that I've just done a chapter with made some really interesting points about how what we need when we're young adults is the everyday support, what we might call early help. The everyday support to keep us ticking over, rather than having to get so in trouble that we then get a proper, what they call a proper service, and we might call eligibility-led statutory services. You know, these are all really sensible points. They're backing up what you've been saying for years as professionals, and they also offer some quite, I think, important challenges. You know how we keep going on about how, well, when they're over 18, if they've got capacity and they don't consent, we can't work with them. Yeah. We're kidding ourselves if we think that we're working with under 18s who don't consent. Like, we're kidding ourselves if we think teenagers are really going along with the work. Just because we don't need their consent doesn't mean we don't need their consent. So there's a bit of mythology there, and I thought those young people, yeah, really made me think when they offered that challenge.
Thanks, Des. I think it's really important when we hear people's views, those people that have been through it, to hear what they say.
Which is a nice point for me to say that Max also makes a great point about how when you think you're doing consultation or co-production work with us, not everything we say is right, which I thought was such a good challenge. It's like, God, ever since I was about 14, professionals have just nodded and smiled at me, even when my ideas are silly. I thought that was such a good, sobering moment. He also once said to me, yeah, all those meetings I went to, doing my children in care consultation, I was 20 before I realised that not all meetings had pizzas in. I thought you were supposed to be preparing me for employment. Anyway, sorry, enough glibness. I can see a colleague got their hand up and might have a much more sensible point to make. Come on in, Alka.
I don't think I'll make more sense. I sit on the safeguarding board, but I don't work with children. I'm an adult service provider, so it's my interest to know, because like David said, is we worry about employing 18 plus. So that is a worry, and you know, where will we take them if there is a problem? HR warn us straight away between 16 and 18 what issues are. I worked up until COVID for 4 years with Calthorpe Academy, where I had 3 young adults, and we were trying to put them in the transitional period, but we did all their risk assessments. And for me, working with them 3-4, children didn't even want to say hello. And right in the end is like they were coming in the office and sitting down. We found ourselves vulnerable, but we did all their risk assessments. So obviously, if David, you say you work with the services, obviously we can support younger services integrating with the adults, and services like ours, or, you know, care homes and nursing homes that get support internally, because we know the safeguarding rules and the children's services know, and then we can communicate with the managers. Just my input. Thanks. I'm done talking.
No, thank you. And of course, having sensible, sophisticated, proportionate information sharing, having processes and infrastructure that help rate fluidity, all important. What you made me think, and I may not have said this in my talk, so it deserves saying now, is that the trick you're trying to pull off is not extension of what we do for 12-year-olds, for 25-year-olds, nor are you looking to simply import what happens for adults into what happens to teenagers. There's something actually about, so it's not extension, it's actually creating a distinct part of the system where you've got alignment. You're aiming for coherence, not cookie cutter consistency. You know, the mid-teens to mid-20s are a distinct and unique bit of the life course. So it's about designing an offer for that part of the life course, not saying, which children's social will just keep going for the 7 years, or which adult safeguarding would drop their thresholds, neither of which are sensible or sustainable solutions. I know that's obvious, but it does deserve rehearsing. And if you find yourself struggling to persuade, I don't know, a bean counter or a politician or someone important about the need for more transitional thinking, ask them when they realised they became an adult, in a nice, polite, respectful, safe way, of course. Because I ask probably about 1,000 people a week at the moment, and some people will say younger than 18. Often they were carers, for example, or they had difficult childhoods. Most people will say when I had my kids. Some people will say when I started nursing my elderly parents. No one has ever said I became an adult at midnight on my 18th birthday, ever. None of us believe that to be true. Some of you spent this morning picking up the socks of a 24-year-old, I expect, didn't you? You know, we know that adulthood doesn't kick in on your 18th birthday overnight, and yet we are colluding with the pretense that it does through the way we have designed our services. Michelle, do you want to make a quick point? And Rachel, just stop us, because I don't know how the agenda's looking at this point.
Hi, Des. I think the one thing I will take away is when you said, you know, we put a lot of investment in making our adolescents unhappy. And I think that comes around the supporting people to make those positive risk-taking decisions, and actually making sure that we're offering them opportunity to learn, you know, so take a risk, but take a calculated, informed risk that support you in your journey. And I think professionals very often are risk adverse to that. Not just individual professionals, but even team professionals. And I think that's maybe where we could really invest in some support in Solihull, is making sure, you know, yes, this is risky, but this is going to lead for the growth of the individual, really.
Nice point. Michelle, even if you hadn't got adult social care written on your name, I'd know you were adults, because you talked about positive risk taking. And not to sound like a bad MC, but if I'm talking to a children's crowd, I say risk, you say management. Whereas when I'm talking to adults, if I say risk, you say enablement. That's a pretty stark contrast in terms of how we even think about it. And you're right to pick up on the risk aversion. And the risk aversion has been well documented in children's safeguarding. You know, Munro report, and even the government now recognise it. We have to ask why the system has created risk aversion. And in particular, we want to ask ourselves, given that adult social care assurance, inspection by any other name, is near as, damn it, a certainty, how do we make sure that we avoid the potential consequences that inspection assurance might bring, like risk aversion? It's a question, but let's horizon scan a bit here and try and preempt some unintended consequences that could come down the track. And whilst you're at it, it'd be terrific if you could help your colleagues working with teenagers think about risk enablement, because it's not been very allowed or promoted or understood in work with adolescents, and yet it's crucial. You've got to make mistakes as a teenager. I mean, just look at the chat here. You all turned out fairly brilliantly from what I can tell. And you made all sorts of silly mistakes and did all sorts of risky things in your adolescence.
Lovely. Charlie, is that an old hand or a new one?
No, it's a new one.
Lovely.
I just obviously you're talking about systems and I love that, and one of my points is particularly when you were talking about preventative safeguarding measures, and I've already said about my bias for the community sector, but I just think it's really important for colleagues and in across sectors to appreciate that, to have the community sector in that system, and do it in a way where it's not you make the referrals, but you work together as closely as possible rather than just handing over. And we, like I said, we work with 12 to 17-year-olds, and a lot of them have a fierce hatred of social services and children's services. So it takes a lot to get a referral. Obviously we will do the referrals, but we like to do it in a very sensitive manner, which sometimes, as long as they're not in immediate harm, can take a little while, so that we don't ruin that trust. And so there has been in the past a lack of understanding when we haven't made referrals as quickly as possible, and things like that. And I think it's just making sure that, in that system, a lot of the colleagues on this call are statutory services that, the VCS are brought alongside. We've got loads better in Solihull than we used to be, but I definitely think there's still room and movement to make sure that we do, because we can be the greatest allies and the greatest tools in this sort of work.
Absolutely right. And thank you, Charlie. And actually, the points you're making, I think, are equally applicable to a wide range of universal services, even if they're not in the voluntary sector. That notion of, I'm worried about you, but I'm worried that if I tell someone in statutory services, I'll lose the trust, which is a real conundrum and fraught with problems, of course. I suppose a couple of things to pick up on. Universal services, and very much including often voluntary sector services within this, the role is not just identification and referral. It can't be. I mean, anyone can call it in. It's about creating safe spaces, rehabilitation, healing, promoting resilience, being that trusted ally to the person to enable them to engage with other services as well. That, to me, suggests, respectfully, she says, not having to sign the checks, that any partnership worth its salt should be thinking about how everybody who works with people can access high quality reflective supervision and support. Because it doesn't seem right to me that there is a hierarchy of entitlement to reflective supervision and support, where social work and many allied health professionals get it, and police, justice, community sector, education. If you work with people in pain and you do it properly, it's going to hurt some days. It's not much more complicated than that. And we wouldn't, if you were construction workers, we wouldn't send your building without a hard hat. You know, whatever agency you work with, and if you work with people, we shouldn't be sending you out to do that without the necessary safety equipment. So for me, there's like a real moral issue there around how we support people to navigate the fact that actually I'm going to need to call this in, Charlie, and I know you're going to be angry with me, but you know, I've had the support to process it and think it through. All that stuff is really complex, and I think in part it relates to the point that David and I were just picking up on there about creating a system where you draw down specialist expertise closer to the person. You don't fire the person up into the specialist services. So if one of your team needs to call it in and say you're worried, we don't sever the relationship they have with the citizen and send them to David's team, only for them to hate you and David, frankly. We draw down some of the talent from David's team around your staff member and the citizen in question. Does that make sense? So you've still got eyes on it, you've still got that assurance, you've still got some of that due diligence going on, but we're being led by human need and context.